Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jeffrey. First of all, can I give a big thank you to Mile for setting this up today, and it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to the people who are on the webinar today. Just to give you a very brief introduction for myself, I began working with what is now KPMG in my early days, then moved over into education, and then about 9 years ago I set up my own consultancy and training organisation, which is called Tony Swainston Limited. And since then I've worked with a number of organisations, training, leadership, coaching and culture change. I think, as Mr. Jeffrey said, I've worked in quite a number of different countries now, around about 12 around the world, as well as the UK, so Saudi, UAE, Kuwait, Colombia, Senegal, South Africa, and you can see other countries there. The main country I do work in beyond the UK now is in fact in Saudi Arabia, and I've been there on 15 occasions now. Some of the organisations I think Mr. Jaffrey's already mentioned, so I'll just put these up as an introduction here. These are some of the organisations that I've had the great pleasure of working with in Saudi Arabia. So basically today what I would like us to look at is this whole question of, or the whole thing about the way great leaders actually think. And for the structure of the webinar, I thought it would be useful to look at this kind of structure. There are four fundamental questions that really, I suppose, we all ask ourselves whenever we're entering into a new piece of learning. The first one is why? Why are we bothering to look at it? So I'll talk about why it is that we will be looking at this whole thing of the way leaders think. Then we go on to the what, the detail, if you like, of what that actually means. What does it mean to think like a great leader? And then we'll go on to the how. How do you, or how does anybody develop their thinking to think like a great leader? And then the fourth bit is what if, which is a kind of creative, what can I do once I've got this information? So just going through that again, we've got the why should we think like a great leader? What does it mean to think like a great leader? How to think like a great leader? And then finally, what if I tried to think like a great leader? So we'll run through those kind of initial questions, if you like, as we go through the webinar. So let's start first of all in the first part of that, which is why should we learn to think like a great leader? It's interesting to start off to look at what great thinkers, if you like, have said about about the way we think and the way that they think and the actions that we will result, if you like, from our thinking. Aristotle said famously, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act but a habit. Shakespeare said there's nothing either good or bad, that thinking makes it so. As leaders, I believe, therefore, that we need to be aware of the way we think. Thoughts create the people we become, they create the leaders we become. And here's a quote from Henry David Thoreau, that thought is the sculptor who can create the person you want to be. So the way we think determines our levels of success. Think effectively and success will naturally follow. For over 2,000 years, great leaders, therefore, have understood the way in which our thought patterns influence our success in the world. The thinking of great leaders is what makes them great leaders, and we can learn to think in highly effective ways as well. This is why understanding the way that great leaders think is so important. And even more important than that, I believe, is that we can use techniques to help us grow as ever more effective leaders every day. And of course, that's the theme of this webinar. The world needs leaders who use their influence at the right time for the right reasons, who take a little greater share of the blame and a little less smaller share of the credit, perhaps, who lead themselves successfully before attempting to lead others, who continue to search for the best answers and not the familiar ones, and who add value to the people and organisation they lead, and that comes from John Maxwell. In addition, though, the world doesn't need just leaders. The world, of course, needs great leaders, and we're going to look at what it takes here, in my view, what it takes to be a great leader. So what does it mean, then, to think like a great leader? First of all, what does being a great leader actually mean? Many of you will know, no doubt, the work of Jim Collins, and he talks about level 5 leaders, and these are people who tend to have these kind of attributes. Self-confident, enough to set up their successors for success. They don't just want to keep the success for themselves, but they want to breed in the organization great people who will also come through with great success. They're humble and modest. They have unwavering resolve. They display workmanlike diligence. They're more what he refers to as a plough horse rather than a show horse. And what he means by that is that they're willing to get in and work very, very hard and not just be somebody who is on show. And they give credit to others for their success and take full responsibility for poor results. They attribute much of their success to great luck or good luck rather than personal greatness. This is what Jim Collins talks about as level 5 leaders. And indeed, level 5 leader builds enduring greatness in an organization. That's what it's all about. It's not just for the moment, but for the future as well. In terms of Daniel Goleman, he talks about 6 different leadership styles: directive, visionary, democratic, affiliative, pace setting, and coaching. Perhaps the affiliative is the one that might be least familiar, but it's essentially about getting to know other people. And what Goleman says from his work is that great leaders have a great span, the whole set of these different leadership styles. But I'd really like to look more in detail about what it is that actually helps somebody to think like a great leader. So I kind of have my own equation of success, and this goes like this. We have our inborn traits, perhaps what we've been born with, and added to that we have the acquired attributes, the things that we've learned over a period of time. And in my equation, these two things are effectively multiplied by what I call internal drivers. And it's the internal drivers multiplied by those two things that give the individual a level of personal performance and success. Just looking a little bit more in detail at the equation itself, the inborn traits are about temperament, perhaps mental ability, talent, and things like that. The acquired attributes are a modification, first of all those 3 things, together with knowledge and skills that the person will have acquired over a period of time. But what about the internal drivers? Well, these things are about the beliefs, habits, attitudes, and indeed expectations. And it's my experience working with leaders over a period of time that these things are the things that really do make an enormous difference. In fact, they are the rocket fuel, as I call it, that gives a person that level of incredible individual personal performance. So we amplify what we've got. If we looked at it in terms of a kind of graph, our level of success and our internal drivers, if we start off with inborn traits and acquired attributes, but our internal drivers are fairly small, then we'll achieve a certain level of success, which increases as we go along the axis with our internal drivers. And so we get this general overall progression, I believe, and I see from my experience with leaders that I work with, that their internal drivers are the critical thing which influence their level of success. So just remembering what those internal drivers are: the beliefs, the habits, the attitudes, and the expectations. And it's really those things that I believe that we can work with in terms of our internal talk and the way we think, that we can then ever more, or each and every day, we can increase our ability to be effective and become great leaders. So how do we influence Well, I believe that we can decide how we think and how we talk to ourselves. This will influence our internal drivers, and effective thinking is essential for us if we want to be a great leader. Let's look at the how now, how to think like a great leader. Now, I'll just give you a challenge for a moment, and I know you won't be able to respond to me the way the webinar is set up at the moment, but if I could just ask you to read this phrase that's going to come up on here. In fact, it's a set of letters, and if you can just take from that a series of words. So if you read this, if you could, and you might have read there, opportunity is nowhere, or you could read opportunity is now here. Often what's in front of us every day is not so much the fact that something is there, but it's rather the way we're viewing it as to what we see, and whether we see opportunities or we don't see opportunities. By the way, if you thought opportunity is nowhere, that's not a negative, it's just obviously here an analogy of the way that we interpret the information that we see around us every day. But our thinking process will strongly influence the way we actually see opportunities or not every day. As leaders, I believe, we need to ask ourselves, are we the subject or the object of our lives? By subject, I mean that the person who acts, who is prepared to take action and do things. They tend to look at what is and what can be. Other people tend to look at what is not. They're often acted upon. So you hear them say, I would be able to do this, but, and if they use that word but, it's generally that they're going to, if I'm being brutal about this, find an excuse for not being able to, or they think they're not able to do something. In fact, I refer to this as the locus of control. It's a psychological term which is about whether somebody lives on the C or the E, whether they consider themselves to be the cause or the effect of things, whether their locus of control lies inside of them or it lies outside of them. And just if we should ask ourselves all the time, is our locus of control inside of us or is it external? In other words, are we in control and are we the cause, or are we driven by events and effects? I'm sure if you look in your organization, you'll find people who are very much on the control side, and maybe other people who are more looking for excuses, perhaps, and are more on the effect side. The fact is that great leaders have the locus of control firmly embedded within them. They don't look for excuses, and this is a natural part of the way that they think. And the way we think affects another part, which is actually a physical part of our brain, which is called the RAS, the RAS, which I know in Arabic is head. In this case, it's actually a small part of the brain, which is called the reticular activating system. And it's a fantastic part of the brain which allows us to be able to spot things that we think are important if we fix that into our minds. It almost happens on a subconscious level. So our thoughts impact upon our RAS, the reticular activating system, and this is the portal through which nearly all information enters the brain. And as leaders, they are always great leaders are always activating the RAS with things that they're looking for. So spotting opportunities for us is a kind of an opportunity that comes along. Our brains will tend to delete, distort, generalize information that comes along. And they act a bit like a filter, the brain, because so much information coming in, it needs to be aware of what is the important stuff from the information which is coming along. That brings us into an associated state, which makes us take a decision, which leads to actions, which then leads to results, which then can lead to further impact on future opportunities, which then goes back to whether we spot those opportunities in the first place. What this diagram is trying to show, in fact, is that the way we're thinking and the way that great leaders think is always about positive things, about opportunities, and they have a way of talking to themselves which allows them to be able to spot this without actually always consciously having to think about it. The human brain, again, a fact is that it's 3% of the body, a people's body weight, and yet it uses 20 to 25% of our daily energy supply. Quite surprising. How much of that energy is being used to support us growing as great leaders? In fact, just to think for a moment about the way that small changes can lead to something enormous. I'll just buzz through this, but if you ever taken a piece of paper and folded it, you know that you get to a certain point where it's difficult to fold it anymore. It's about 6 or 7 times perhaps where it becomes difficult. But let's just say that you could fold a piece of paper 10, 20, 30, 50 or even 100 times. And if that's a difficulty to actually think that, because you'll think, well, maybe I can't fold it. Well, just imagine doubling the thickness of the paper 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 times. Think for a moment and just guess, if you folded it 10 times, or doubled the thickness of the paper 10 times, in other words, how thick would that be? Well, let me tell you. It would be about the thickness of your hand. That's about 10 centimeters. So in folding a piece of paper 10 times, it gets to about the thickness of your hand. What about if we fold it 20 times? Think for a moment. Folding a piece of paper 20 times, how thick would it get to? Well, in fact, it'll get to about 1/3 of the height of the Kingdom Tower, which I've been to on a number of occasions, and that's about 100 meters tall. The Kingdom Tower is around about 300 meters, so folding a piece of paper 20 times, surprisingly, will get you up to 100 meters. 30 times, you're no doubt thinking very big now. How far will that, what thickness will the paper get to? By the way, this is true. This isn't just a kind of a trick or fantasy. Well, it will get you to the outer limits of the Earth's atmosphere, about 100 kilometers. Quite extraordinary. 50 times, of course, we're getting very big now, you'll actually get to the sun. And that's 100 million kilometers just by folding a piece of paper 50 times. Fold it 100 times, you'll get to the radius of the known universe. A lot of kilometers. So really what this is about is that little changes that we can make within ourselves can lead to enormous impact. Bruce Barton says something which I think is wonderful, that sometimes when I consider what tremendous consequences come from little things, I'm tempted to think there are no little things. Over the last 30 years, the field of neuroscience has grown enormously. We've learned more about the brain in those 30 years than in the previous 3,000 years. And this is becoming more and more applied now in the field of leadership development. The human brain is around about 1.3 to 1.4 kilos. It contains 86 billion neurons. Each neuron can make 1,000 to 10,000 connections with other neurons. And new learning is created by new connections. All our beliefs, habits, attitudes, and expectations, what I talked about earlier on as being our internal drivers, come from these, and they form these connections in our brain. So just as a learning of a factual piece of information, our habits, attitudes, and so on, our internal drivers are created by hardwiring connections in the brain. Each thought we have, therefore, creates or reinforces old thought connections or new ones in our brains. So how can we use this information to support our growth as great leaders? There's a lovely little kind of analogy, I call it the Mercedes T-cycle, that thoughts that we have create emotions, which then create actions, and we have this kind of cycle going on in our minds all of the time. I call this the leadership tea bags, and as a leader, which tea bags will you put in your cup today? What sort of thoughts will be taken into a cup, if you like, and hot water put in there for it to kind of infuse in the cup? And what sort of leadership thoughts are we going to put in our minds today? Because these will create connections in our minds. Estimates by experts say that 30 to 50 thoughts we have per day. That's around 43,000 to 72,000 every day. And great leaders use these thoughts, whether they know it or not, to support their success. And we can learn also to use our thoughts in a purposeful way. So formalized talk is what my book, The 7 C's of Leadership Success, that I wrote in 2012, is really about. Sometimes it's called Affirmations, and it's the basis of this particular book. The 7 C's, in fact, are the 7 key characteristics of highly successful leaders. And each of those characteristics, I give 10 dimensions. These are the behaviors, the attributes, the beliefs, and the values that combine to produce the key characteristics. And each dimension then has 10 affirmations. So in total, the book has 700 leadership affirmations that I've collected over a period of time from listening to and thinking about what great leaders actually do in the day-to-day basis, the way they think. Affirmations enter the subconscious mind. Tony Robbins, who many of you will have heard about, says by repeating an affirmation over and over again, it becomes embedded in the subconscious mind, eventually becomes reality. That's why we need to be what you think and believe, because that is exactly what you will get. And it's my strong belief in their heads, which allows them to be as which is positive, it's in the present tense, it's as if it's happening, and it's personal. And it's also, it's useful to have a lot of visual, auditory, kinesthetic kind of thoughts and ideas going on in our minds. So affirmations are things that we can use on a daily basis. In the 7 C's, these are the 7 C's themselves. So I look at leadership of having certainty about what they're doing, looking at clarity, collaboration, having coherence, convergence of ideas, consolidation, and consistency in what they do. And those are the things I've focused on, and for each of those, there are, for example, with the C3, which is collaboration, there are 10 different dimensions that I've talked about in terms of collaboration, which I won't go through that list of things there, but you can see that. And then for each of these, in fact, there are sort of affirmations. So an affirmation is just, I show fair treatment to all people at all times. And I think that great leaders do this kind of thing. They are having this self-talk. I display empathy by being sensitive to the feelings, values, interests, and well-being of others. I treat people equitably and fairly in all my interactions. Now, the idea with these affirmations is that if any of us feel that we're not doing this at the moment, by focusing on these and thinking about them, they can start to become part of the way we indeed operate. They work because connections in our brain are created. Our RAS that I mentioned earlier on is triggered. And you're on the lookout then to see yourself succeed. This is what affirmations help us to do. So what if you tried, or I tried, to think that finally on these 4 dimensions, I tried to think, or anybody tried to think like a great leader? The impact you have, I think, is about, first of all, the impact for yourself, but of course that links in with the team then. I call them me, myself, or a person themselves, and then linking in with the we, the team. But even bigger than that, it goes to the us, which could be the organization as a whole. So a culture change will effectively take place if people start to think differently in an organization. I did quite a lot of work on culture, and this is a diagram of a culture analysis. It's used by an organization called Human Synergistics, who work all around the world, and I use this particular culture analysis. In brief, the blue is great. It's the good stuff. Achievement-focused, self-actualizing, affiliative, humanistic, encouraging. The pink and the green are least, really things that we try to lessen as much as we can. This is often, and this was, a particular organization that I worked with, their current reality when I first worked with them. The slightly thicker circle that you can see 3 circles out here is the average organization around the world. They would have a pink, a blue, and a green that would precisely fit within that. Now, no organization will be exactly like that, but if organizations are averaged out around the world, that would give you a kind of picture. So more pink here means that they've got more perfectionistic kind of stuff going on, which on the face of it might sound good, but it means that people are so focused on detail that they're not looking at the bigger picture. They have a lot of avoidance here, a lot of people being highly dependent, conventional, and so on. And the blue, you can see, is less than the average. This is the current reality in this organization, and this is how they wanted it to be. So two different surveys give these two different pictures, one which is, again, the current reality, and then you can see what they want it to be like. Now, the interesting thing is here, what difference does that make in terms of the way an organization develops and whether its level of success? Interestingly, Cotter and Hesketh studied, in fact, 207 organizations over an 11-year period, and they wrote about this in their very famous book called Corporate Culture and Performance. And let me just summarize what they found here. So this is looking at the income, the share price, and the profit of defensive cultures and constructive cultures. Defensive cultures are cultures in this pink and green type of mode down here, and the constructive cultures are in the blue. So if we look at this, if we look at this then, the defensive cultures, over an 11-year period, their income went up by 166%, their share price went up 74%. Interestingly, their profit went up, but only by 1%. If we compare that with constructive cultures, you can see an enormous difference, quite unbelievable in many ways, that their income went up by 682, the share price went up astronomically compared to defensive cultures, and most importantly, their profit went up by 756%. So 4 times higher turnover, if we look here, but more importantly, the profit has gone up by a 566 to 1% increase in the profit. Culture makes a difference, and leaders in organizations who speak positively to themselves, work effectively with their people around them, will develop a kind of very positive culture. So the key ideas here are our internal drivers, the importance of our locus of control in helping us develop as leaders, our RAS, our reticular activating system, how what we think can activate the RAS and help us to look for opportunities, our self-talk, of course, and the affirmations that we make. And finally, in the words of a person who's now unfortunately passed away, Lou Tice, but was the managing director of the Pacific Institute, a great guy who did some fantastic work with all sorts of organizations. He said, "We act not in accordance with the truth, but in accordance with the truth as we perceive it to be." Thinking and talking to ourselves in the way that great leaders talk to themselves will help us to create the kind of organization that we'll be proud to be part of. You can go to my website, just tonyswainston.com, and there are lots of free resources there, including the audio of the 7 C's of Leadership Success, which means that you can then listen to the affirmations that I speak. So if you're in a car and you wanted to listen to them, or you just wanted to listen to them any time, I take you through these different affirmations. And the idea is to focus on a few at a time and to really think about them. Training that I do involves, if you want to contact me, I'll give you the information on the next slide, but it's bespoke training for organizations and for yourself, leadership and management training right the way up to the Institute of Leadership and Management Level 7, ILM Level 7, also coaching and mentoring training up to Level 7, and of course, as I mentioned, culture analysis of organizations as well. So those are my contact details, and I will now hand back over to Mr. Jaffrey if I could, and see if there are any questions that anybody would like to ask me.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Swainston. Folks, we are now open for the question and answers. If you have any questions, you could either raise your hand or you could insert the questions in the question box. So let me go straight. We have a first question by, let me try to unmute. We have Mr. Saeed Al-Zahrani. Mr. Brother Saeed, could you please unmute yourself? I see you have muted yourself, but you have raised your hand. Brother Saeed. I believe you have muted yourself, so let me go straight to the question box. There are a few questions there. Okay, is it possible for all people to develop the thinking process of great leaders?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Mr. Jaffrey. I would say probably not, if I'm realistic about it, but I tend to have a pretty growth mindset about this. So I feel that the biggest determining factor is the desire and willingness for somebody to want to develop themselves as a great leader. My experience is that it requires that level of commitment, determination, and that's really what is the kind of thing that can move people forward as great leaders. So I think on the whole, it's impossible to say probably that everybody can develop as a great leader, but what I would say is that everybody can always move themselves higher up the scale, if you like, and who knows where they might end up as a result of that. But it does require a level of thought, commitment, and desire.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another one from Brother Matwali. The question, rather comment, said, I think the paradigm has already shifted from great leaders to great human and collaborative leadership. I think the best models we can follow is leading from behind, leading from inside out, and servant leadership models. Any comments?
Right, good. Yeah, I think that that's very interesting actually, because the idea of a servant leadership model is very much along the lines of what Jim Collins talks about in Good to Great, in fact. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I probably would add as well that it might be familiar, some of the notions of what we consider to be great leaders, but the experience is, if research is to be believed, is that many organizations around the world are still operating on a very perhaps even coercive level of leadership where people are being told what to do, rather than the Jim Collins level 5 of trying to develop leaders for the future. So I agree that in many respects, excuse me, in many respects the paradigm perhaps has shifted to a certain extent in many people's minds, but I think it's perhaps more of a common sense rather than common practice in terms of many organizations. So I think there's still a lot of way to go.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another one from Mr. Chandran. The question is, how do you encourage or cultivate the constructive culture when they are not the leader or the head in the department?
Right, okay. Yeah, very, very good question. I think the sad truth is that leadership, as great as it can be, can also be highly negative. If you like, the person, in other words, a person who's in a leadership role has a great, great influence. We know this again from really all the research that's there. They have a big influence on, of course, the immediate people around them, but if they're the top person in an organization, then they can have clearly a big influence on the whole organization. I think that an individual who might feel that they are not in as much control as they would like to be, I think I would sort of suggest a couple of things perhaps. One is to look at their own locus of control and where they think they are in control of things, and really focus on those things and not to kind of be too focused on the things that are beyond their control at the moment. So I think that there are certain things in life that we just have to probably accept that, you know, we just don't have too much control over. I live in England, and people in England complain a lot about the weather. There's not much we can do about the weather, but people still complain about it. And I think that those things are outside of our control. The locus of control for that is very much outside of us, except that, of course, people in England could live somewhere else if they wanted to, but then they'll sometimes say, but I don't want to move. So, you know, we have to sometimes look at the things that are within our control and focus on those. So, and again, just going back to the paper analogy of folding a piece of paper, sometimes making small shifts, small little things that we do can start to have perhaps a ripple effect or start to have a cumulative effect in an organization and lead to something which is quite enormous. So accepting that if somebody is not in a position within the structure of an organization where they think they can make the immediate decisions, I understand that, but I think there are still things that we can do.
Thank you very much. Another short one from Mr. Prasad. The question is, can leadership qualities be taught in family itself during formative years? Any examples can you quote?
What a wonderful question. Who asked that? That's a great question. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And my response to that is definitely. If you would like me to give you a reference of a book which I believe is fantastic, is by Professor Carol Dweck. It's D-W-E-C-K. Professor Dweck has done research for nearly 40 years now, and she's written a book which is simply called Mindset. So Professor Carol Dweck on mindset. And I think that I do some work within education and with schools, in fact, and within Saudi. I've worked with the Ministry of Education in Saudi, in fact, working on this. And it's something that at a very early age, the way that we talk to our children can strongly influence the way that they think about themselves and whether they, for example, really welcome challenge or they don't. And great leaders, we know, actually welcome challenge rather than seeing it as an obstacle. They think of it as a challenge which can be overcome. So yes, I think we can at a very, very early age, and it's better if we could do this, we can actually start to develop the leadership characteristics in our own children for whatever they want to do in life. And it isn't just about necessarily leadership in terms of an organization. It's about them being happy, satisfied, successful, feeling empowered, being able to overcome challenges that they'll experience in life. All of the things, in fact, that bring about success in an organization are all the things in many ways that bring about success in a person's very personal life as well. So I would recommend that as something that you could look at in terms of developing leadership qualities perhaps, or general personal qualities that are going to benefit young people.
Much. Should the destructive and constructive culture be in balance, or constructive culture should be in dominant culture, especially when there are a lot of young team members in the organization?
Good question. Well, I mean, if I don't know, can you still see the PowerPoint on the screen, or is it gone now?
It's still very much there, sir. So you can...
I don't know whether you can still see this. I don't know whether you can still see this.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, you can still see it?
Yes, we are.
Okay, well, yeah, okay, fine. So, really, just going back here, again, the blue is the positive. There are 4 dimensions to it on this particular culture analysis. The pink is really the kind of aggressive defensive. The green is the passive defensive. Experience shows that the more we can decrease the pink and the green and increase the blue, then the more successful an organization would be. When I showed you these figures here, these were many organizations that were looked at in terms of being either defensive or constructive, organizations that we're very familiar with. For example, Pepsi-Cola, Rank Xerox, a number of different other organizations that are, you know, well-known organizations that were either determined at the outset to be defensive in their nature or constructive. And this shows the way that very sense of either being defensive or constructive influenced their level of success enormously. For me, it's about developing a coaching culture in an organization. It's about people being more humanistic, encouraging, affiliative, all of these things, which I think it comes about very much from a kind of coaching culture, which I worked within Saudi as well, taking a number of people through a coaching qualification for their organization and working individually with a number of organizations like Al Salam Aircraft Company and people like Elm and Abunyan and many other companies as well, looking at how this can influence their culture through coaching. So I think that you're always probably going to be left with an element of if going back to this, you're probably always going to be left with some of the pink, some of the green, the defensive styles. That I think it's human nature. It's probably never going to go completely, but the more we can reduce that, then the more we can have a healthy, vibrant, successful organization.
Thank you very much. We have one last short questions on authentic leadership. Does a good leader have to be a good actor?
Well, that is a good question as well. I mean, I think that there has to be sincerity. There has to be a sense of the person being authentic. So I would say no. I don't think you need to be a good actor, but maybe at the outset, if we think we haven't got certain characteristics that we need to develop, we might need to do a bit of, if you like, I suppose you could call it acting with yourself, in the sense of practicing and thinking about the various aspects that we need to develop. I'm very interested, for example, in emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence about a person understanding themselves, being able to manage themselves, having empathy for other people, and being able to lead and manage other people as well. I suppose summarizes emotional intelligence. And the research by Daniel Goleman shows that that is very much something that we can develop. So emotional intelligence might not necessarily be something that we have in great abundance to begin with, but again, if the desire is there, then we can develop it. And I think that's the encouraging thing, really. It is about having the commitment, again, to develop it. If that takes a little bit of acting out internally to begin with, then maybe we need to do that. But at the end of the day, people will perceive our authenticity and what we're truly about. But if we want to develop empathy, we can try, and we can actually do it. And that's what, you know, Goleman's research on this shows very clearly.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Swainston. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
I think, no, I'm happy with what I've said, and I sincerely hope that it's offered a few kind of little thoughts for people to reflect on. The presentation as a PDF will be available, I know, through Miles. So no, I'm very happy to have had this opportunity, and thank you very much indeed to people who've been a part of the webinar, and of course to people like yourself, Mr. Jaffrey, and Roveda, for setting this up from the point of view of Mile as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, Mile, for your valuable time and a very, very intriguing presentation that you delivered live with us. So once again, thank you very much, sir. And thank you all of those who participated in this webinar and for posting interesting questions. A lot of you are asking about the presentation copy. Please be informed that this presentation copy of the webinar will be shared with you via email post this webinar session in about next 24 hours. So please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org for all our upcoming webinars, also to access the archive sections. With that note, we would like to conclude this session, so you all will be automatically